Hi everybody, welcome to Stereo Photography on Film. My name is Steve Novak and I'm going to talk about my experience with a couple of different stereo film cameras. First, we need to ask ourselves, why analog? That's a loaded question with no correct answer, in my opinion. Why do people love the warm sound of a tube guitar amp? Why are people fascinated by the smooth sweep of a second hand on a mechanical watch? Why are vinyl records popular again? These examples all have pros to them, but if an enthusiast of any analog device says there are no cons, they are flat out lying. Just because digital technology has made things cheaper or more efficient doesn't mean they have no cons either. For me personally, it's a journey to get lost in and sometimes obsess over, searching for that correct guitar sound or correct film stock for a certain look. The best answer to the question, why analog, is simply, why not? The analog film cameras in question for today's presentation are the Kodak Stereo Camera and the Reto 3D camera. Both are quite different from each other, and each one has its own pros and cons. I will try best as I can to outline those with specific examples in the slideshow photos. What are we waiting for? Let's take a look at some stereos on film. I think what I love about stereo photography is that it brings a simple photo to life. Yes, it's just a cat, but in 3D, it comes alive. And I think the stereo photographers would agree it's enjoyable to take sharp stereo pictures of moving objects if you've only shot sequential stereos. By the way, on the left side, you will see the title of the stereo and any details including the camera and film stock used to shoot. I've included this picture because I really liked how well the Kodak Stereo Camera handled the movement in the shot. That's not always the case. I have plenty of photos with motion blur, but sometimes it's probably just me shaking the camera. I also wanted to include this photo to show how sometimes you end up with two frames that are exposed slightly differently. You'll see the left is brighter than the right image. I'm not totally sure if this occurs during the shot or during the scanning process. In any case, this is usually easily fixed in the Stereo Photo Maker program. All you do is click Auto Color Adjustment and it will match the color and exposure. But if the difference is too much, like in this picture, it can lead to excessive contrast. So I left it like this. In my opinion, it is still a usable stereo pair that I am happy with. I bet you were thinking this whole presentation would be in black and white, but here we are, in living color. I do want to point out the fact that the stereos you see, whether in color or black and white, have had almost no editing to them. If the photo was excessively dark, I may have brightened it a bit, or vice versa. But I especially did not want to change the color profiles of these film stocks. Otherwise, what is the point of shooting real film? Also, please excuse my title choices. This might end up being a controversial slide. I really enjoy it with stereo photography how sometimes you don't need a subject at all. It's nice to just see scenes for what they are in 3D. Obviously, a well thought out subject using leading lines or the rule of thirds is important for a photograph and for a stereo photograph. But I will also die on the hill that you can just take a photo and get lost inside the 3D frame. If the depth is decent, you can let your eyes wander from the fence to the tree to the Skylon Tower in the background. There is interest if you look. Nothing is more touristy than walking around Niagara Falls with a camera, except maybe walking around Niagara Falls with a film camera. and a stereo film camera at that. Finding a couple on their wedding day having photos taken is just a sign to take a stereo, of course. If anyone recognizes this couple, I would love to give them this stereo as a wedding gift. This is a candid shot on Center Island in Toronto. I just loved the scene. It was a very bright day, and yet this bench was under some very shady trees. Trying to account for the shade, I ended up overexposing the sky. It's almost totally blown out, but I did end up bringing it back a bit in post-processing. No edit to the color though, that is pure Fuji color. Parallax, the subject of every stereo photograph, and here it is. Literally, it's right there on the left side of the frame. Did I really include this shot just because after I reviewed all the stereos I took, it happened to say parallax? Yes, yes I did. The Kodak Stereo Camera nailed this shot. I had to move fast while focusing this one. Our father was moving quite quickly with his lunch at the Mexican Day Festival in Toronto. The camera has zone focusing indicators on the right lens, which can be helpful to quickly compose your stereo photo. Here is where we get artistic. Double or multiple exposure photography. It's easier on the Kodak Stereo Camera than any other film camera I have used. Snap your photo. On the bottom side of the camera is a manual shuttercock. Cock it again and snap it a second time. Cock and shoot as many times as you like, but you will eventually overexpose the film. Thought needs to be taken in regard to exposure, and there are lots of resources online for multiple exposure photography that can be helpful in the beginning. Here's another interesting double exposure. Some skill, but mostly luck, taking a shot of the skull at Dracula's castle and moving down the street to this elephant at the Big Top Mirror Maze on Clifton Hill. The elephant appears to be falling into the mouth of this cloudy, ghostly creature. One more multiple exposure shot before we move on to something else. By taking 3 separate shots of my favorite model against a black couch, we end up with 3 almost floating skulls in varying depth. The dark background makes exposure simple. Just move the camera and shoot the skull in a new, almost unexposed spot of the film. Night photography and long exposure photography can be very rewarding in mono or stereo. A tripod and cable shutter release are must-haves to take sharp photos with long exposure times. Calculating the reciprocity failure for film is also necessary, and you can usually find helpful charts for each film stock to ensure you are exposing your film for the proper amount of time. Truthfully, I need to get out and do more night photos with the Kodak Stereo Camera. Sometimes the hardest part is actually just getting up and doing it. Every so often, I'll take the camera on the drive into work and shoot photos in the very early morning before dawn. Not a night photo, but a long exposure photo, as it was quite early in the morning and there wasn't a lot of available light to use faster shutter speeds. I really like the color of these brick walls on Kodak Gold 200 film. Let's finally look at some stereos from the Reto 3D camera. What do you do when you see an old truck? Take a stereo out of the window of your truck, of course. One could argue I could have taken this stereo sequentially, but if I didn't notice the car in my side mirror and wait for it to pass, it would have become a rivalry. Speaking of rivalries, this is a good film example to show how sometimes there is an excessive amount of dust or scratches or other imperfections on the film. They don't totally distract from the stereo, but larger flaws can turn into large rivalries. They can be edited out before or after you assemble your stereo pair, if they are unwanted. If the conditions for exposure are correct, nothing is faster than a stereo taken with the Reto 3D camera. Just point and shoot, then wind, and point and shoot again. It's nearly identical to an old disposable film camera. Just make sure your subject is more than 3 feet away and everything will be in focus. I was skeptical of the Reto 3D camera. Its plastic lenses couldn't rival the Kodak Stereo Camera lenses, or any other camera's lenses, could they? They proved me wrong. It's a fun camera to take along depending on the conditions, and they can give excellent results. The Reto 3D camera is very compact. Mentioned before, think old disposable film camera. Perfect to throw in your car or bag at the beginning of your day. And on your way home from work, you can stop at the side of the road and snap a very fast stereo of a cow with her calf. Being able to take very fast stereos has its drawbacks. With no aperture or shutter adjustments, things can get a bit washed out on a bright day. Things can also get a bit too dark. This will depend on your film speed and some careful planning of where you're going to shoot. Though, I still love being able to take a stereo of crashing waves. Try that sequentially. I will end the slideshow with this stereo, seeing how it's October now, and this seems very relevant. Hard to believe I've been sitting on some of these photos for a year. I do love wandering around different places, taking photos and stereos. That's probably the draw for most photographers. Scanning, editing, and assembling the stereo pairs can be fun too, but I would be lying if I said I didn't have folders of left and right images that have not been put together. The film or digital debate may not even be relevant. What's important is actually assembling the stereo pairs and sharing them with the rest of us. There are a lot of things to consider when choosing any camera or a stereo camera. Go back and check through the slideshow. I'm not claiming to be a stereo expert or even a photography expert. I just do what I do for fun, and in my opinion, sometimes I get decent results. Does the total simplicity of the Reto 3D camera appeal to you? Or would you like to be able to take multiple exposures or long exposures with the Kodak Stereo Camera? I can tell you either one will give you good results if you have patience with it and are willing to spend a bit of time and money on film, of course. The main thing is to get out and shoot photos or stereos. With experience, you will get better at metering exposure, composing your shots, and everything else that's necessary. The best stereo camera is the one that you go out and shoot with. Thank you for listening and watching to this slideshow. I hope it was informative in some way. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out and message me. I'd be glad to try and help. I'd also like to thank the virtual stereo community for reaching out to me to put this slideshow together. I hope it was worthy of the excellent members and past presenters. Also, a big thank you to all the people in the stereo community, especially the ones who I have reached out to and still do for help when it comes to learning all about stereo photography. You know who you are.